Welcome to an artist talk that is funded by the Katherine Hyde Charitable Trust. The MSSU Spiva Gallery and the Department of Art and Design here at Missouri Southern State University is pleased to host Arcana, a solo exhibition by artist Adam Posnak. Adam Posnak grew up in Macon, Georgia. His great-grandfathers were blacksmiths, his grandfather a woodworker, and his mother a studio potter. Posnak holds an MFA from Louisiana State University, Baton Rouge, and a BA from McAllister College, St. Paul, Minnesota. Adam teaches ceramics and foundations at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, and his home and pottery studio is in West Fork, Arkansas. The show in our gallery, the work in the gallery, reflects Adam's interest in diverse esoteric conceptions and praxis. A wide study of cosmology and symbolism reveals a surprising degree of agreement across systems that are separated by time, geography, and culture. So I'm going to welcome Adam to the stage to tell us more about these systems and the symbolism therein. Welcome, Adam.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming tonight. Thank you to the professors for forcing your classes to come. It's always what you're praying for in academic lectures, that somebody makes their classes come, and thanks to the students for following your directives. I also want to thank Christine and Franken Ceramics for kind of, inviting me to come here and have the show and talk to y'all tonight. One thing that I kind of wanted to start out with is I'm kind of interested broadly in the notion of tradition and kind of like what constitutes a tradition, some of the ways that you might define a contemporary tradition versus a, time immemorial tradition, and what maybe are some of the benefits or drawbacks of adhering closely to a tradition that you're part of, or kind of diverging to. And I think there is such a thing as like a contemporary American pottery tradition broadly, and then kind of maybe a more specialized tradition within that I'm kind of a part of. So that I just thought I would start out talking about that, and then kind of go into wherever my own work sort of fits into that. So I grew up in Macon, Georgia. It's where the Bible Belt buckles. And I never had any interest really in being an artist or a potter, ceramicist, or anything. But my mom was a potter. So this is one of actually her pieces, Becky Posnak. So I grew up with I think a weird combination of a kind of a real awareness of handmade objects, craft, and specifically pottery. And also, they were so ubiquitous in the house that I just never gave them a second thought and really did not care about them one way or another growing up. I sort of had a vague idea that it was kind of cool that my mom was an artist, but other than that, I never really thought about it. And I certainly had no intentions of being a potter. These are some other pieces from my mom, more recent, and I think there's a little bit of a hint here in the way that my work eventually developed, in that there's a very traditional form present, and also a little grain of real weirdness. So these are bed bugs. My mom decorated her pots with bed bugs. I mean, honestly, that's weirder than I could ever shoot for. So I feel like that, I was somehow ingrained both in the pottery and in the weirdness, which I'll talk about eventually. But we also, there was a pretty vibrant pottery community in the area of Georgia where I grew up, in the region more broadly. a couple of key artists were Ron Myers, who taught for years at the University of Georgia in Athens, and a potter named Michael Simon, who also lived in the area. And I think amongst, a whole lot of pottery influences, these were like the first pots that I saw, my mom's and these two guys, and probably remain the biggest influences on me today, or even as my work has developed more recently, with some other things too. I went to the McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota, again, with no desire or thought to study art whatsoever. But I ended up taking a class from this woman, Victoria Kristen, who's also weird. I mean, she's got a bunny rabbit in front of her, on her ledge in the studio. But it turned out that I took this class just to fulfill a humanities, fine arts requirement, kind of fell in love with the process. And it turns out that I had kind of, been living in Georgia in this very rich pottery-centric environment. And then I probably went to like this area around the Twin Cities in Minnesota is like, it is the mecca of American pottery due to this kind of tradition that I'm about to talk about. This is a pot of Victoria's, and she was a student of this guy named Warren McKenzie, who taught at the University of Minnesota for years and years and years, produced a whole lot of students who then went on to teach at other universities or work as independent studio potters. And Warren McKenzie was kind of the product of two major pottery influences who were his teachers, Bernard Leach of St. Ives, England, and Shoji Hamada of Mashiko in Japan. So these two guys, Hamada and Leach, were kind of close cohorts, confidants, and collaborators, not on the work specifically, but they just had a close relationship where their work developed kind of in tandem throughout their lives. And, this kind of meeting of the British potter, the Japanese potter, diffused down into this American potter, I think is what I am sort of considering this pottery tradition that I feel like I'm a part of, because I've got, there's Hamada and Leach, McKenzie, Victoria Kristen, and then me. So it's like not that far removed even from, these kind of titans, of history. And it's something that I think about a lot. To what degree am I like continuing that tradition? And, to what degree have I ruined it maybe? And I just wanted to show a couple of the kind of key, if you're into pottery at all, you would probably know a lot of these people are sort of the titans of the genre now. This is Linda Christensen, Jeff Astrike, Mark Ferris, Randy Johnston, and Michael Simon, who is from Minnesota, was educated up there, and then moved to Georgia. So all these people were in one way or another students of Warren McKenzie's, and still live in a like 30-mile geographic radius. And they're some of the, considered to be, not just by me, but by even more reliable people, some of the most lauded potters in contemporary history. So, that's kind of the, I guess, the foundations of my making, and I just really fell in love with that, the whole kind of mythology of a potter living in a rural area, making things that people actually use. I feel like the world is so filled with stuff it's so audacious to think about making another thing to add to the clutter, to me. But at least I feel like if nothing else, you can drink coffee out of it or use it as a doorstop or something, an ashtray, whatever. And I think that's kind of remained the what's anchored me like in pottery. And I think too, one thing about a tradition is that it gives you some parameters, and I think some people find parameters kind of, you know, hindering or oppressive. But for me, I've always felt like whatever the bounds of pottery are is kind of comforting. It's like I don't go in the studio with just no bounds to what I'm gonna do. There's a kind of, it's like a game of tennis. There's lines, and you kind of have to adhere to the parameters of the game. If you don't, then you might be doing something interesting, but it wouldn't be tennis still, I guess. And then, I just feel like what I've kind of added of my own into this sort of tradition of utilitarian pottery is a kind of a weird outlook. And I have this sticker, this Post-it on my refrigerator. It says Skeptimist. And it's kind of a reminder to myself of the mindset that I want to cultivate, which is, not to just like be totally credulous and just believe absolutely anything, to have a dose of skepticism and a kind of a value of a certain degree of rationality, but also to be optimistic that there's a lot of possibilities out there. And I think we're conditioned to kind of only look at reality in terms of a certain school of definitional factors that don't account for all maybe the possibilities. I think science is good and great, and I'm definitely, I'm not like a facts are a relative thing type person at all, and I think that's a very dangerous road to go down. But I also think that, Cartesian kind of science just isn't equipped maybe to assess certain things either, and those are kind of the things that I find myself interested in. So I'm kind of like a walking conspiracy theory. Not a conspiracy theorist. I want to make that really clear. In fact, just as a side note, I'm interested in the phenomenon of conspiracy theory. I'm interested in the people who kind of propagate that. I even have a certain sympathy for them, to be honest, but I'm not advocating conspiracy theory. I'm interested in the phenomenon, not the belief in the actual theories. So I'm sort of nominally Jewish. I'm actually Jewish on the wrong side in the Orthodox tradition. My dad's Jewish, but it was the only sense of spirituality at all that I was raised with, and that was very, very minor. I've kind of been once in the future Freemason as part of my artistic research. So, I believe in a kind of in anthropology, they would call it like a participant observer. So if you're interested in a phenomenon, you want to learn more about it, and definitely if you ever want to speak about it, you kind of better have that experience. So I take that actually really seriously in my work in general. I'm interested in like the esoteric movements that came up in the latter part of the 1800s, of the 19th century in Europe, France particularly. Things like alchemy and Rosicrucianism, all the things. And I'll explain this more in a second, but I've also come into pretty close association with some what I would call esoteric traditions that are part of what I would call the African Atlantic. So that's a way of thinking about a community that includes the diaspora and continental Africa. And this is just a pot from an experience that I had in Ghana in West Africa, which I'll talk about in more detail here in a minute. But you know, pottery is definitely a part of this esoteric interest pool that I have. In kind of becoming acquainted with some of these things, somewhere along the way, I was asked to see if I would be willing to, or see if I could even. I was asked by a person who was part of a tradition that's commonly known as Santeria. It's not the preferred term by people who practice this religion that has, it's an Afro-Cuban religion that has very, very deep West African roots and a kind of a syncretized, a mixture, layering of European Catholicism. It's a better term than Santeria is Lukumi. And it turns out that in this tradition, there's a belief in a pantheon of deities, and practitioners have, you know, who have gone through the proper, it's not just a thing that's open to anybody. You have to go through a very, very rigid, circumscribed set of initiations. But people who have done that are given these sets of pots that contain like the what are considered to be the kind of spiritually activated substances that are aligned with a particular deity. So it could be rocks, you know, water from the sea or a river, whatever, herbs for sure. Particular mixtures, very specific mixtures, are kept in these pots on an altar in the person's home, and they become like the focal point for religious practice. So I was asked to make these pots, and you know, I kind of did it once, and then somebody else asked me to, and before long, I just sort of am getting contacted because it turns out that this community has mostly used like repurposed pottery that was in no way, shape, or form made for their particular practices or with the aesthetics or the kind of rules in mind. So that has been kind of a line of studio work that's gone pretty separate from, but adjacent to, you know, what I would call my like normal work, which is in no way normal. But it's really been a kind of an invitation to participate in a community that's pretty marginalized, and only more recently, I think, has received sort of popular kind of recognition. One project that was part of that overall thing, but a little more of its own thing too. I was contacted by a guy who is an anthropologist who I later kind of think of as sort of the mirror image of the space that I'm, you know, attempting to occupy in ceramics and pottery. So he's an anthropologist who is also a participant in a tradition of Yoruba religion, which is in what is now present day Nigeria and Benin. So he's, you know, spent a whole lot of time living, practicing, experiencing, and then, you know, writing, and now as a professor at a university. So he asked me to he wanted me to do a project that was pretty interesting because he gave me a lot of free rein, but also some kind of reference points. So he would send me a photograph and he'd give me kind of a, you know, like I need the pot to be this big, basically, or whatever. And then I would just kind of respond to it in whatever way I wanted to. in this case, that's a photo of a dancer with an elaborate costume that kind of spreads out as they twirl around. And, you can see that's kind of reflected in the pot. And then in some cases, the work became like really collaborative where he would, I would make these pots and send it to him. He would then assemble them according to the, parameters of orthodoxy and incorporate these other kind of materials that, shells, dirt, beads. And in this case, the big pot that's containing everything I made and the 2 jars with lids I made, and then the other pots are actually made by potters in Benin, and as the sculptures were too. So it became this really interesting sort of really cross-cultural collaboration in a way. And even, he would go over there and bring these things back to the US, and then I would make whatever he needed. And that's a collaboration that has gone on over time, whenever he sort of needs something. And this engagement kind of, it became apparent at one point that like I really needed to go to a place where there were teachers, basically, because I kind of felt at a point that I had gotten sort of to the end of where I could get alone or looking at anthropological sources. I really wanted to learn about and learn from potters who were really deep within the traditions that I was now kind of involved in, or at least adjacent to. And it just so happened fortuitously that my wife, Jeannie Hewlin, who's out there now, who is also a ceramics professor at the University of Arkansas, amongst other things that she does, was appointed as a Fulbright scholar and decided to go to Ghana, and which she actually let me help choose, and that was very kind. It turned out to be, I think, one of the most transformational experiences for certainly for me, and I think I can speak for my family as well. Our kids came. But leading up to that, we had made some preliminary trips to Ghana, and these are our colleagues, Jeannie's colleagues, really, at the university where she was teaching, which is KNUST, Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. It's like it's the art university in Ghana, the main institution for studying art. And, it's really, it was just as a potter, as somebody interested in ceramics, a craftsperson interested in crafting, it's just mind-blowing the way, and I know this is not unique to Ghana, it's true in many places across the world, but this is where I was kind of, my eyes were opened to a place where handmade objects are not kind of rarefied or specialized or, set on a shelf as a thing to kind of admire abstractly. But there are certain kind of pots that it's like, it's like a set of measuring cups that almost everybody maybe in the United States would have in their kitchen. They're handmade pots that occupy that ubiquitous use, and that there's like no household almost in Ghana that would not have, a couple of these pots. They're not generally viewed as like, quote, fine art or whatever by most people, although I think the tradition there is starting to gain some kind of recognition and wider appreciation. But this is a group of potters who are using I would call this wheel that they're using that involves one person turning the crank and the other person throwing. It's like a contemporary traditional tool. They've only been around, I think, 50 or 80 years or so. It's not like the old way of making pots, which I'll talk about in a second. And the use of this is a very interesting thing, the use of the mechanical wheel is almost exclusively, at least in traditional spaces, it's only the providence of men. Women don't generally make the pots this way, and traditionally men don't make the pots at all. This is this form that is so widely used in Ghana. It's like a wide, shallow bowl with textures on the inside, and it's used for all kinds of things in food preparation, scraping like peppers and onions and stuff to kind of make a puree, and then eventually the stew or the soup is served in that pot, so it takes on the patina of all of that, people say that, if you make your food in a plastic dish, it just will not taste the same because of the way these pots sort of, absorb and then reconstitute the food making process. This is the older way of making pots in West Africa broadly. And it's always, until the last probably 50 years, it's been exclusively the women who make pots. And there's even like some traditional taboos that, understandings that men should not make pots because of there might be certain negative kind of side effects. And I don't know if any of y'all have taken pottery classes, but this totally blew my mind, the way that pots are begun all the way on the ground. So people bend all the way over like this to start the pot, and the top section is made first, so that's like the rim of the pot that you can see there. And then after the clay starts to firm up, the bottom section is added. And they're incredibly skillful. I mean, these look like they came out of like, if you could, these have been kind of damaged or whatever, but like so uniform, so perfect. The walls are exactly perfect thickness. It's amazing skill. And so these are what I've shown so far in speaking of the pottery in Ghana, are kind of pots for everyday use. So there's the cooking thing. These are kind of all-purpose things. The one on the far left is a water jar. But the things that I was really interested in studying, there hasn't been a tremendous amount of art historical coverage of African pottery in general. I mean, there's sort of like, it's always treated as sort of a general subject, a broad kind of overview. But these pots have almost not received any kind of, art historical attention. And these are the pots that are specifically made for religious ritual. And they're kind of the same people who make daily use pots make these too, but it is a separate process and it's understood to be separate. So there are certain things that people will do to kind of prepare themselves for making these pots. They make them on certain days of the week and not others. They're stored separately. And you could go to a pottery village, and normally a pottery is kind of in a village setting because it's close to a rural area where clay is located. But you might not even see these pots if you were just taking sort of a quick tour of the pottery scene. And in fact, there's, I know of a book that was written about a particular pottery village in Ghana that completely didn't mention this avenue of pots at all. So it's definitely something that I feel like deserves, there's such interesting, even not knowing the particularities, which are extremely important and interesting. Just as aesthetic items, I think they kind of, you know, they're clearly something different than things that are made for everyday kind of secular use. So this is like really what I was hoping to learn about. And where I sort of sometimes try to pretend to be an anthropologist or an art historian by total default, just because nobody really seems to be interested in these things. So it's something that I would like to learn more about, and then kind of promote or write about in whatever way I can, because I just think they're such exquisite and kind of amazing objects. So this will lead in back to some of my interests that, in addition to everything I've talked about so far, kind of go into my personal work, I guess. This is a kind of a chart or a table that's related to Jewish Kabbalah, which is like Jewish mysticism. It's like the if you go past the surface of a thing, whatever is kind of the deeper undercurrent is normally called like esoteric. So this would be like Jewish esotericism. And I try to spend a couple hours a week consistently not at all understanding Kabbalah. So I wouldn't never even try to explain what these diagrams and charts are about. But I think that you can appreciate them without knowing what they're about. They're just so clearly, look at the detail of this thing. Like, it's just, it's kind of basically supposed to be outlining a kind of a visual depiction of a cosmological structure. And I feel like it gives that feeling, even if you don't know the ins and outs really of what's going on. If you look much into Kabbalah and the kind of social and philosophical milieu that kind of birthed that tradition in Judaism, it kind of leads back to first, second, and third century places like Alexandria and Egypt, which were just like these crazy melting pots of culture. You had Jews, Arabs, barely just invented Christians, the vestiges of ancient Egyptian religion, Zoroastrianism, all these things just kind of mixing and people sharing ideas. And this is kind of a chart that is both related to Kabbalah and alchemy. This is an alchemical illustration, which are just some of the most bizarre things you've ever seen. I mean, they're like, sometimes they're kind of have an element of macabre or horror, and there's no way to understand what's going on or to kind of orient yourself in that image. To me, it's just sort of like staggering and kind of dizzying in a way, but I'm totally into it 100%. And I'm kind of fascinated with the way that alchemy began as a kind of a pretty strictly materialistic thing. Definitely people trying to turn lead into gold was part of it, but it became much more complicated than that. And it even evolved to where at some point it was understood that to reduce it to a kind of a strictly material process was missing the whole point. The material process of kind of like, kind of grinding something down, burning it down to its, bare essentials, and then kind of resurrecting it into a more refined, perfect material, was doing all the physical stuff was supposed to allow the alchemist to kind of have that process happen on the inside, so that it became it was really, there's sort of a division within alchemy of those who are just kind of trying to do the get rich quick thing, and those who kind of viewed it as an entirely allegorical process. But again, these images, on one hand, I'm totally interested in what they're about. On the other hand, it's all just about the images and this kind of, they often have this kind of vertical, hierarchical stacking, which relates to like normally the processes of alchemy, breaking something down and building it back up. These are some of the kind of symbolic language used in alchemy, or the symbols for, the elements. I mean, you can see up there, the planets and metals. And I kind of draw on this in some of my work. These are some related things that come from Freemasonry. They're called tracing boards. I think they're kind of fascinating images too, in that they just have this kind of weird spatial thing going on with unexplained items that are clearly important because they're there, but you don't know what they're all about. There's definitely a symbolic language going on there that you can't read as an outsider. So, I'm attracted to the images and the ideas. And, another thing that's kind of interests me along the way is how, we have like established traditions of accepted orthodoxy and then sometimes alternate streams. So this is a depiction of, you can probably figure it out, the Garden of Eden, that to me has a very different vibe about it than what probably conventional teachings would sort of lead one to believe. First of all, they're both about to grab that apple at the same time. The snake looks really kind of benevolent in a way, and there doesn't seem to be like a lot of bad judgment going on here. So this is a depiction that's related to this kind of alternative Christianity that many people don't even know about. There were all of these gospels and stuff that whenever they sat down to decide what would be in the Bible, quite a bit of it got chucked to the side because it didn't serve the, whatever the values and the goals of the people in power were. So, there are gospels which will give a completely different and by the way, like a much more feminist understanding of like, or retellings, I guess, of stories that we've come to, have been handed down in the sanction model in a certain way, but it's not necessarily the only way they've been told. This is a piece by one of my teachers that also depicts Adam and Eve, and I think is very different from this one, in that for me, it's weighs me down. I hate to look at this. I mean, I hate to talk bad about Ken Ferguson, who was definitely, a very lauded potter, but this is like not what I want the feeling of my work to be. So I include it as something that I think about a lot in trying to like provide an antidote or another telling perhaps. So like this is my work now. These are pieces that are in the show, so you probably see them. I won't spend a lot of time on them. But I think everything that I kind of talked about comes into my work here and there, and sometimes it's more apparent and sometimes less. I definitely use the kind of vertical orientation a lot, where things are kind of stacked up one on top of the other. I started using these flags as a way to try to like think about how, in certain circumstances, that pot is sort of used as the repository for, at least supposedly spiritually powerful materials, and how that implied energy kind of vectors out. So the flags are supposed to kind of be extensions of the pots, or I don't really know what they're about, to be honest. Kind of like a little less weighed down, I guess. So yeah, so this is the work that I make now, and thank you guys so much for listening to me ramble on. Really appreciate it. If anybody has any questions, I'm glad to do my best.
So are there any questions?
It's okay if you don't. Too.
What type of clay do you use?
So I use like a pretty standard, terracotta earthenware clay. That's the, if you know about clay, it's really like the recipe is officially formulated for cone 04, 03, 04. But one thing that I do a little bit unorthodox is fire it. I fired to 01, so a few cones higher, and it makes a pretty significant difference in the color and just the kind of, I don't know, it approaches a kind of a stoneware like, it kind of rings a little bit more than earthenware does. And what I think the way that I started doing that was that like I wanted to barely use any glaze. It's like that's technically the thing that I have the most trouble with is getting my glaze thinned out enough so that it's not like, I don't know, it doesn't look like, and even sometimes it still does, looks kind of plasticky, or it's like sitting on the surface instead of kind of integrated into the clay. So I wanted to use like barely any glaze, and if I fire it that hot, just a little tiny, very like the glaze is so thin, it just like, I mean, it almost looks like it's like thinner than skim milk, but it gives the right amount of sheen at that temperature.
I saw that you also use red and blue sparingly, but it's very vibrant. Is there a reason that you use those colors?
So it's interesting. I use blue actually. I use blue as a stand-in for black. But I also use black, obviously. So I can't. So I needed the the colors associated. It's funny actually. The colors associated with kind of a spiritual force, I guess you could say. They're the same in alchemy. They're the same in the West African traditions with which I'm familiar. They're the same in a lot of places around the world, and it's white, red, and black, sometimes signifying really different things. In alchemy, they're very, very prescribed, so that like if you see those colors in an alchemical manuscript, you automatically know what step of the process it's referring to. But I needed something else, another like highlight. So I just used blue because there are also places, some traditions sort of allow blue and black to be interchangeable and maybe not even differentiated so much. So that's why blue. I had my greatest fear is that people say, "Oh, you're using red, white, and blue."
You had mentioned earlier about, at the start of your presentation, about these generations of potters learning. Do you feel like you're continuing this tradition at the University of Arkansas?
I don't know. Yes, yes. Only in that my students don't see any of this crap ever. They have to really dig and beg for it. I would say that only a small fraction of people that I've taught probably, I mean, they certainly don't go to my website. Why would they? so the pots that I make in, I mean, I kind of have this wonder, there's always, like, I'm never super settled about my work. And for, I always wonder if there's like an alternate and maybe more correct or slightly better universe or reality where I'm like a wood fire potter and stick really closely to the kind of pots that I grew up with. And so teaching allows me to lead that double life. And so those are the kind of pots that I sort of use as teaching models. So in class demos and stuff like that, I don't make anything like that for sure. So I guess, but I definitely would not, I mean, I feel like the thing about this kind of, it's sometimes called Mingei soda. It's a play on Minnesota and the Japanese folk philosophy and theory of Mingei that kind of came together in this guy, Warren McKinsey. It definitely has the part of the philosophy is that like you make pots in this case kind of quickly and fluidly and not necessarily like, not that you're not careful or invested, but each individual piece maybe is not labored over to the nth degree. And the theory is that like, you'll definitely have some winners and losers. The losers will still be able to, eat cereal out of, and the winners will somehow kind of transcend, the limitations of somebody whose like ego is super in the front, So I think I always tell my students that like, I think most people are conditioned in this culture to refine. And sometimes the best thing you can do is, once you get to, I guess, a point of, you have to have a little bit of get over the technical humps at the beginning, but like maybe the best thing you can do is test yourself on how little to refine something, and then just trying to step back from it and try to assess it as objectively as you can, because people mostly, I find that students will always gravitate towards refinement. They want to perfect it. And I'm like, maybe just leave that fingerprint and then see what it tells you later, I don't know if this answers your question.
Any more questions? Nope.
Cool. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank you. So we do have a reception, should be set up by now, in the gallery or near the gallery. So hopefully we'll see you over there.